man-made, and one of is nanowires. When we talk about the nanowires, so nanowires are nanoscale width, but it can be long. So in one-dimensional, they are normally considered one-dimensional because their length can be longer, but width is very small. Let's say 2 nanometer width, and if it is, let's say, 2 micrometer long, so that would be considered nanowire. So as a rule of thumb, you don't have to agree on that, but that's what people consider. If the ratio between length and the width is more than 1,000, so it means if you divide length, which is 2 micrometer, and the width is 2 nanometer, so that will be 1,000. So that thing can be considered as a nano wire, okay, or 1D, because it's considered 1D. All this 2D, right? It has also width, but in general, if the width to length ratio is more than 1,000, we can consider it a 1D material, one-dimensional. So nanowires, the silicon nanowires are very commonly used, and there are also, it has quite a few applications. The most important thing why we need to make things on nanoscale, the reason is that it can provide you very good sensitivity and a very high surface to volume ratio. So you have more surface area as compared to the size of the thing. For example, if you take a tablet and you take it for some disease, if it's in tablet form, it takes longer. But if it's in, let's say, in nanoparticles, if you take those nanoparticles, then it will dissolve very quickly because it has significantly higher surface area than the larger tablets, for example. So if we talk about the nanowires, we have to look at the synthesis process. So the nanowires are actually, the process itself is called the CVD. So CVD is chemical vapor deposition. So let's say if we have a material and we want to deposit silicon on top of the material, right? So do you remember CVD or not? Can someone tell me what was the CVD? Okay, what was the PVD? PVD stands for? Physical vapor deposition. And in that we heat up the material, and then we let the material to evaporate, and then if there is substrate, it can deposit there, right? Let's say copper, you can deposit gold, or aluminum and other metals can be deposited. There is another process called CVD, where the material which you want to get, which you want to deposit, actually is present in gaseous form. Let's say in the case of if you want to deposit silicon, so you can choose SiH4. So silicon has 4 external atoms, right, electrons. So SiH4, each H on each side. So there's a silicon gas. There is also Si2H2 also available. So those gases are used, and then you have a wafer, but you also have to provide energy to the environment inside the chamber, and that energy is normally provided with the heat. So you normally heat up the whole furnace to close to 600, 700, 800 based on the process, and then the material in a gaseous form will react and on the surface and start getting deposited. That's how the CVD was working. So if you want to make a silicon nanowires, for example, we have to let's say if there's a material, you bring a silicon source in a gaseous form, SiH4 for example, heat it up to 1,000 degrees, for example, and then it will start depositing on the surface. But now, let's say if we want to make, but that will deposit on the whole surface. But now, let's say if we want to just make a nanowire of a silicon. So in that case, how we can achieve that nanowire dimension? Any idea? We can do lithography actually first. We can take a substrate, do lithography with the e-beam lithography, for example, and make small circles. Open up those windows. Like the size of the circle would be the size that would be the diameter of the nanowire which we'll be building, right? And then you let the silicon to come and in a gaseous form and react on the surface, and then it will only grow only the areas where you have window open, right? So you have to choose the material as a mask which doesn't allow the synthesis of a silicon on the surface. So only the areas which are open, in that area the silicon will start depositing and it will grow on towards the top. So in that way you can have nanowires, but that's not the most efficient way. So how people do it? They actually use some catalyst, and metals works at the catalyst. I'll explain you how that works, but basically on the surface, let's say on this surface, you first make small structures of metals. You can, let's say, have a wafer, you deposit gold on all the surface, right, and do lithography, open up small areas where you want nanowires to grow, and then etch everything else except those small circular gold structures on the surface. So basically you have a wafer and it will have small spots of gold at different places. Once you have that, then you have to bring actually again the let's say if it's a silicon, or it can be a carbon nanotube also are grown that way. So let's say if it's silicon, then you can put it in an environment where you have SiH4, for example, as a source. You increase the temperature to 1000 or 1100 in this case, and at 1100 or 1050, if it is a gold, it will melt. The pit which you made, it will melt down because it will be melting temperature of the gold, and then the gas will start dissolving in the liquid gold. So that's called the eutectic alloy. So do you know what is alloy in general? When you say, okay, this is alloy, what do you mean by that? Alloy is a mixture of two materials, right? It's a copper aluminum alloy. They are mixed together, mostly physically, so they don't make bonds with each other. But you mix them together. Let's say if I have aluminum and copper, you heat it up at a very high temperature, melt them, and then mix them, and then let them solidify. Then it will become alloy. So in this case, it will be a vapor liquid alloy. Means you are heating up the chamber to 1050 degrees centigrade. That will melt only the gold, but the substrate, which is silicon, it will not be melted. It will be in a solid form because silicon has a higher melting temperature. So when this will melt, gas will come, and then it start dissolving in alloy. Okay, once it start dissolving, after a certain time, it will saturate this alloy, and then at that time, then whatever gas is dissolved, the silicon will start depositing on the surface. It will start growing, nucleation. It will start nucleating on the surface. So basically, then it will start growing only in that area. So silicon will be like the CVD, start depositing only in that area where there is a gold, and then the gold will start move to the top. So in that way, you can grow actually silicon nanowires on the surface towards the upside. And this is another explanation which I explained to you. So transport of silicon to the catalyst, which is a gold in our case. Surface reaction. Eutectic alloy, so it dissolves in the gold. Then transport to the liquid. Transport in the liquid, so this gas which is dissolved, can move to the bottom, right? It will be mixed in the gold, and then it start depositing there, start attaching and growing on the surface. So silicon nanowires finds a lot of applications, and I'll just give you two examples. So in this case, they have built a nanosensor. It's a nano FET, nano field effect transistor. So it can be used as a biosensor. So in this case, we have made a source drain, and then the channel region in this case is actually just one nanowire. Okay, so it means a very thin wire which is connecting source and drain. And then we can functionalize these nanowires with the surface chemistry, and we can attach antibodies with it. We can attach single-strand DNA, for example. And let's say if we want to see if the other DNA is present there or not, so we can attach a single-strand DNA and let it incubate with the target. If it is binding there, so it will change the charge on the wire. So it will change the charge on the wire that you can sense. So it will affect your conductance of the wire if something gets attached on the surface. So you can use that also as a antibody antigen detection. For example, in this case, you attach some antibodies, and then when antigens comes, they will bind with it, and that will change because the proteins also have a charge on them, right? So Just give me a second. I have to take this. I'm sleeping. So these nanowires can be used actually as a biosensors in this case. And this is another example where they have actually used nano FETs or nanowire-based transistors. Basically, there is a source and drain again here, and where they attach the antibodies. So when the wires comes and bind with the surface, it will change the conductance. Let's say virus is attaching on the red here, so it will start, the conductance start getting reduced because of the presence of the virus, and that can be detected. So even a single virus, because the nanowire is very sensitive, and even a single virus or even few proteins can produce that change, which you can detect it. It's called the label-free technologies, means you don't require any fluorescent tags or anything fluorescence to sense it. So this is, but there are some issues with these sensors because when they don't work very well in the matrix, like blood or serum, because the serum and blood also have a lot of other components which change the conductivity of the overall solution. So then it has a high background noise. So, but if your sample is isolated, let's say if viruses are isolated in a very low conductive buffer, then they should be able to detect it. So that's the one limitation which people are facing. But there are ways to go around it. And in one example, I noticed that, which was an interesting paper published in Nature. What they did is they had a small area, so they actually covered the whole nanowire with something and only functionalized a very small area at one place. So there will be only one antibody attached there. So it's complicated to do that, but when a virus attaches this, if other background things will come and bind with the surface, it will not produce a change. Only a small area where the antibody is attached, it will produce change. So in that way, it was more specific and it can work with the little bit dirty environment. So, but these sensors are very sensitive. On the other hand, even a single virus, if it happens to come attached on the surface, we can find out if there are viruses there or not. So it can be used for other applications also. So there is another important structures, it's called the quantum dots. So the quantum dots are actually nanoparticles, but they are some materials which can give fluorescence. So when you talk about the quantum dots, there is a concept, it's called the quantum confinement. So I have to use a dock camera for a minute. Okay, so when you talk about the quantum confinement, what happens when you look at it in general material, if you are familiar with the energy diagrams, so let's say a certain area, if this is the energy, and so in normally the materials, they have valence band, and there is some normally some small band gap, and then there is a conduction band here. So when the electrons are in conduction band, that's where they will start producing So the electrons, normally when you apply them, give them energy in terms of a voltage, for example, or heat, the electrons from valence band jumps into conduction band and start conducting, right? That's how it normally works. But what happens, people have learned that when you confine the material size to small area, in that case, if you look at in case of quantum dots, and you make the material very, very small, so you restrict their sizes, let's say 2 nanometer, 1 nanometer, in that case, you still have a valence band. But in this case, you actually, with the confinement, your band gap increases. Then the bulk material, and now your energy levels are actually discrete. So previously the energy levels were all mixed together. Okay, so they are not very identifiable. But in this case, the energy levels are very discrete. Means either electron can jump to one energy level or other energy level, so they will be very specific. So, for example, if we have a quantum dot, which we have designed, in that case, it will be jumping to one energy level, so this band gap, so it only jumps to that energy level always, and it's very discrete. And once we let it cool down, it will come back, it will release energy in the form of light. Okay, and so let's say if it is producing energy in form of light, so it can give actually red, green, blue based on where that energy level is. And that we can tweak with the size of the particle. Let's say if there's another quantum dot which has a higher band gap, like from here to here, so the band gap is this much, and that is normally done if you decrease the size even lesser, let's say 2 nanometer, then the band gap increases more. Now the electron wants to jump to the higher energy level and then come back, they will also release energy in the form of light. But this would be higher wavelength or lower wavelength, or high frequency or low frequency as compared to this one.
High frequency.
It will be high frequency because the energy is dependent on Hc over HCF or Hc over lambda. So high frequency means Hc over lambda or HF. So high frequency means more energy. So it means more energy is jumping from a higher energy level to the valence band again. So it will be producing a wavelength of a high frequency, and which would be in this case, let's say blue, for example. Blue is a high energy level or red is high? Blue. Okay, so in that way you can, by confining the size, you can have a discrete energy levels, and those energy levels are dependent on the size of the particle, and that you can tweak. And that was very interesting observation. If I give you a simple analogy to just memorize it a little bit, let's say if you take a small bar and you tie a rope with it. Let's say I have a rope which is this much long, and the other side is free. Okay, this is just an analogy. It doesn't mean that the electrons work exactly the same way. And now let's say if you start moving the rope up and down, so you can make actually quite a few different wavelengths, right? You can make a larger wavelengths based on how you're moving. You can make smaller wavelengths, right? You can have many different wavelengths. If you look at if you grab the rope on this side, let's say it can be this much. It can have even higher wavelength. Let's say if you grab it here, if you grab it at that place, it will make this angle, right? It can make that angle. So it can make many different angles. So means that is a wavelength. It's not complete, but still a part of it. So you can have more freedom to choose what kind of wavelength you want to choose. Let's say now in the next example, we tie it between the same thing, between two bars, the same rope. So now we are confining its movement, right? So there is no freedom to move both sides. But now we can still move it in the middle. You can have, let's say, this wavelength. At max, you can have this wavelength, right? Or you can have also smaller wavelength. But you cannot have this wavelength. You cannot also have this wavelength, right? So in that way, you are confining the wavelength of the rope, the wave which will produce. Now let's say if you increase the size, make it a little bit far. Now the rope might be only this much, right? Now you will have very less number of waves it can produce. So it means you are confining. So this you can consider as a, maybe in this case, a band gap, for example. So you're restricting their movement. So the electrons can only jump from one level and come back. So they cannot have more waves. In this case, the rope. So the similar way, when you confine the movement of the electrons in a very small area, you make it very, very small. So you confine their movement so they can have very discrete energy levels. And that's where they will start only giving one color at one size. But when you change the size, same material, changing the size can start producing different colors. And that's the quantum dot. So that's what we discussed. Let's look at some quantum dots. So these are cadmium selenide quantum dots. And you see that those are quantum dots. It's the same material, cadmium CdSe, cadmium selenide, but you can see that their colors are different. And they're very sharp colors. Oh, it's not there. Okay. So these are the quantum dots. Okay, so if you look at their colors are very sharp and very clear. and then it's the same material, just the sizes are different. And another very important property of these quantum dots as compared to other fluorescent dyes which we use is that they give you very specific peak. For example, when we look at the fluorescent dye, people who have worked with the fluorescent dyes, the ones which we use for fluorescence of imaging of the cells, or maybe even the fluorescent imaging of the sensors or other things, or even in DNA, the fluorescence dyes which are used. If you look at their peaks, let's say if there is a dye, when we say its absorbance is more, if you look at this absorbance or emission spectrum, so it's normally something like that. And if there is another dye, it will be something like that. So basically, it has some peak emission, means it will maybe producing 488, for example. In this case, it will be producing maybe 600. So this is a wavelength. And this is intensity. How much intensity it is producing. So in the organic dyes, you never get a single pulse. You have actually spectrum of emission. So it means, but you have a maximum emission at specific wavelength. In this case, 488. In the other case, 600, for example. But there is always an overlap between two dyes. But in the case of quantum dots, you can choose the sizes and you can have the emission only at a very specific wavelength. So it means the quantum dots, even if their emission is very nearby, it will be very specific. It will only give very specific wavelength because it's always jumping from that energy level to the ground state, valence band. So you get wavelength of light at a very specific wavelength always. So that's a very, very important. So the overlap there's no overlap between the two quantum dots because it gives you very discrete signal. And it's very sharp, so you can detect it from background very easily. Okay? That's the one major property of the quantum dots, that why people like it. And so they don't photo bleach also, means if you put in a light, if it's normal fluorescent dyes, if you put in a light for some time, many of them start photo bleaching, means they will not produce fluorescent later on, but quantum dots, they are very good from that perspective also. So they are very rigid materials. Okay, by the way, if I ask you a question in this image, which size is the same material? Which particle do you think would be smaller in size? Which quantum dot would be smaller in size? No, in this color. Tell me the color. They are a different color. Oh my God. So, okay, sorry. So look at this. So this is a figure. So the question is, which color, these are bottles, we just know the color. I can tell you that it's the same material, different sizes. So which size would be, no. So which color is because of smallest particles? So in which bottle there are smallest particles?
Blue.
Yes, blue, one option.
Red.
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 And anyone else? Anyone for green? So it can be either on the sides, okay? When I say smallest, so it will be on the side. So it can be red or blue. But I told you that which has a high frequency? Red or blue? Blue has a high frequency. So high frequency means it really have to go to much higher energy level and then come back so that it can release more energy. And that will only happen when the particles are small. When you make particles more and more smaller, their band gap increases, so you can have actually high energy, discrete energy levels if you reduce the size of the particle. So in this case, it will be blue. Blue will have smallest particles in this case. Okay, so this is some of the examples that the semiconductor nanoparticles composed of 1 to 7 or 2 to 6 or 3 to 5 elements can be designed to make quantum dots. The fluorescence emitted by quantum dots is comparable to that of a standard fluorescent dye, right? So, but they give you very sharp peaks, very sharp color. Let's see if I can find maybe. Let's see if I can find some images. Especially when you look inside the cell, I don't know whether these may be quantum dot related, but when you use the quantum dots for imaging purpose, for example, because they give you very sharp peaks, so their signal is very clear as compared to the fluorescent dye. And if there's a red, it will be red. In the other case, in the fluorescent dyes, if it is red, so it's a spectrum of wavelengths it's producing, but maximum wavelength is red, but it still also produces some other wavelengths. But in this case, it will be very specific. So you can clearly differentiate if it's a red or blue or green in the case of quantum dots. So, and that's why they are used very often for in vivo imaging also. Let's say if there's a tumor and you want to target a tumor with the quantum dots, you can even use the dyes, but dyes doesn't work very well. But in quantum dots, they give you very specific color once they're inside a body. So, and that's why you will find a lot of applications where people are exploring quantum dots for in vivo imaging, to image inside a body, like some structures. So when we look at the applications, the quantum dots has been explored in many different applications. For example, in one case, they are used also in LEDs, because light-emitting diodes, right? So they also emit light of specific wavelength. And for especially high-resolution screens, 4K or even higher, which you can now buy it from commercially, you get a very good resolution when you use the quantum dots in those LED screens. And the reason is that when you have a green, because the color we get it from green, blue, and red, right? How they mix it, that produce a color. And when you use quantum dots, they give you very sharp color. So there's no overlap between two colors. So that's why you can improve the quality of the image which you are seeing. And for high resolution screens, the quantum dot is used. It's also being used for single electron transistors, because you can move electrons to a very discrete energy level, so you can work with that. So it also has been used in qubits for quantum computing and processing. They are being used and researched for biological sensors, amplifiers, and also inside the body. They are also being researched for photovoltaic devices made of lead, I think sulfide, and those are quantum dots which people are exploring for photovoltaic applications. converting photo energy to voltage. So they are being explored for many different applications because of their specific properties. There are also other quantum. Now let's talk about some carbon nanostructures. Those are also very important. Do you remember what is this? It's called buckyball. So so carbon is normally present in three forms. Carbon is also present in carbon nanotube form when it's a tube, right? CNT. It is also present in a sheet form, single sheet, and that is called, when it's present in a sheet form, 2D. So, so the nanowire or single wall carbon nanotube is a 1D material, right? Because it's very thin and very long, right? So if the length to width ratio is more than 1000, we can consider the material as a 1D, one-dimensional only. So the carbon nanotube is a 1D material. You have heard about it. Then if you open up that, let's say, tube of carbon, if you slice it and open it up and make a sheet of it, so it will become 2D, right? And then that is called sliced carbon nanotube or graphene. That is a graphene. Graphene is also carbon. It's just like in 2D format, right? It has very good, interesting properties also. But then if you just make balls of the carbon, single layer for carbon in this format, there's a C60, C400, so it means there are 60 carbon atoms, and they're called buckyballs. It was discovered in 1985. And there was a professor in Rice University, I think he was the first one to report that the carbon is also present in this form when it's circular, and people call it as a 0D material. Okay, and then these buckyballs, and he also later on, I think, shared a Nobel Prize. This Richard Freeman Smalley was a guy who from Rice University. I think he's still alive, who discovered it. And this is the one structure. Then carbon nanotube is also, the carbon is also present in the carbon nanotube format. So let's say this is a carbon nanotube, and how to synthesize it. Now the question is, the synthesis is very similar how we synthesize the single silicon nanowires. But in this case, we use other metals. Other temperature conditions are slightly different, but the process is very similar. Basically, on the surface, there are different ways to make it, but most commonly use the CVD process again, chemical vapor deposition. So in this case, on the substrate, you actually put a metal, small post or small structure of a metal. You can do lithography to make it. And then, in this case, the source gas would be CH4, for example, or C2H3, C2H6. Depends on what gas you're using, and so you have to modify the temperature and pressure conditions also. But the whole idea is that now that gas will come and dissolve with the metal, and then like in silicon deposition, so the carbon start depositing on the surface. But in this case, at specific conditions, it grows only at the sides, and the inside will be hollow, like this. And then that makes it can be single wall, it can be double wall, and you can make long structures. So this is how the process works. So basically, carbon source is placed in the gas phase, use an energy source, which can be heat energy. Carbon diffuses towards the substrate, and that is coated with a catalyst and heated, right? Catalyst can be copper, metal, right? Small spots of copper there. Then catalyst preparation and synthesis of nanotubes, so it starts depositing on the surface like in a CVD, and then in that way it will grow towards the top. There are some variations of the processes, but this is the general method. So the carbon nanotube is present actually in two forms. It's considered 1D material. It is present in single wall and also as a multi-wall carbon nanotubes. So length to diameter ratio is around more than 1000 or about 1000, so we can consider it as one-dimensional, right? So when it has only single carbon atom wall, then it's called the carbon nanotube. Single wall carbon nanotube, it can have multiple walls, let's say 2 or 3 walls. Then it's called the multi-wall carbon nanotube. So definitely multi-wall carbon nanotube would be thicker in diameter as compared to single wall. But it's a very famous material nowadays. It has been explored for 1,000 different applications. And so they're very strong mechanically in certain axial direction. So they're very strong they have very good electron mobility, very good conductivity. Their Young modulus is about, I think, about 950 gigapascal, so it means they can survive that much of pressure. And their tensile strength is very high also in certain direction. And their sizes are small, and that's why people explore it for a lot of applications. Because of its mechanical strength, people are using it in composite materials. Let's say bone implants, or I have one of my colleague, he was working one time on mixing it with a cement or building construction material, and see if we can improve the mechanical strength of that by putting carbon nanotubes there, because they're very strong. And then it also has been extensively researched for applications for bone implants and the bones, which are artificial bones, if you put a carbon nanotube. And the good thing is they're very light, so they're not heavy. So we can put it in the bones, so it'll make them more stronger, but then they have to be compatible with our body. That's the other thing. It's a carbon, so carbon is not that toxic in general, but still there are a lot of work has been going on to find out the toxicity of these carbon nanotubes on different cell types. Carbon nanotubes has been also, because it's a nanotube, like carbon is like silicon nanowire. So this tube, it has been used in making FETs, like carbon nanotube-based FET. If you search it, carbon nanotube-based FET, field effect transistor, you will find many papers. And that can be used as a biosensor, right? As I gave you one example in the silicon nanowire case. Because of their sizes, they are very, very small. They can also be used as a tip of a atomic force microscope. You know, atomic force microscope, you have a tip, and you have to design it so that which moves on the surface and scan it and image it. So if the tube is very small already, so you can really reach small areas, so you can get a very high resolution. And so that's also explored. It can also work as a channel in certain places because the tube, so liquid can go inside the tube. It can be used for nanoreactors. I have seen one application, I don't remember exactly how exactly they were using, but it can be used to actually mix materials inside on a pico liter or even smaller volumes. So you can mix things inside, you can break them and see if the reaction is going on or not inside that reactor, which can be a very small reactor. People are using, I have a student in a previous class, he was working in a company and they were making supercapacitors. So supercapacitors are the ones which we use in car batteries and all that. So what happens when your car battery dies, or other defense applications, when you need a more voltage or power, so you put a capacitor as a backup. So these supercapacitors can give you very high power, very high voltage, but for a little bit period of time. And the carbon nanotubes, instead of right now they use a carbon as a ash, carbon ash in the capacitors, and he was mentioning that if you use a CNT, they are getting much better performance. So, and also people are using for hydrogen storage. So there are many applications of carbon nanotubes people are exploring. For bioengineering, basically, as I mentioned, that it has been used in research, at least for bone implants. It also has been, because they are very small, so they can be used as a carrier for drugs. You'll see many papers where you're using carbon nanotubes as a particle to attach different drugs or molecules. You can also attach antibodies with the carbon nanotubes, so once they go inside a body, they can attach with different cells, right? And they can give fluorescence there if it has a fluorescent dye, and it also produces a contrast inside a body. So because of its size and now the control on its fabrication, because people are exploring it also for in vivo imaging applications and also in vivo drug delivery applications. And definitely mixing the carbon nanotubes with different polymers, and then those polymers can be injectable in different bones to replace a bone. Let's say sometime some part of a bone is broken, and one way is you can 3D print, right, that structure with the bone material, but other ways you can actually mix it with carbon nanotube with the gel, and then you can inject the gel in that area, so the gel will automatically take the shape of the bone defect and then fill it up, and the cells has to like the carbon nanotube. We also did some work actually on carbon nanotube and toxicity of the carbon nanotube on the cells. I have uploaded a paper on a canvas. It's called Toxicity of Carbon Nanotubes and Graphene on Sperm Cells. So what we did is we looked at if the carbon nanotubes are toxic for sperm cells or not. So people have first looked at if the carbon nanotubes are toxic for lung cells or not, because if you're working in an environment where there are carbon nanotubes, they can fly in air very easily. So the first exposure would be eyes, nose, and basically your lungs, right? So people are exploring if the lung cells react to carbon nanotubes, if they produce inflammation or not. So that's one area. So at certain dose it doesn't, at high dose it does produce inflammation. So there was a study published in Nature. They looked at, they injected carbon nanotube, different functions of different functionalized carbon nanotubes inside a body, and then they looked at in a mouse, and they looked at the expression of progesterone and other hormones and see if it affects their fertility. And they noticed that in certain mice, when they inject a certain dose, some of the hormones are less expressed. So less release, so that was affecting their infertility, but there was a reversible process. That's what they discovered. So what we thought, okay, why not we can test it with the human sperm cells directly. Let's see if, and they have shown that once they inject carbon tubes, they go to the testes where the sperms are produced. So basically, they can go to the organs and they can actually have interaction with the sperm cells. So we took sperm cells directly and mix it with different carbon atoms, see if they produce any damaging effect. And the paper is on Canvas, so you can read the paper for more results. But basically, what we found that at certain dose, carbon nanotubes are fine with the sperm cell, but at high dose, I think 5 microgram per ml of sperm sample, they will start producing toxic effects. And so we are not sure whether it's a mechanical toxicity, because mechanically when you mix it, it can rupture the membrane, and because of their size, they can even go inside. So, but we're seeing the cells were dying if you mix a high concentration of carbon nanotubes with the cells. These are some of the examples where carbon nanotubes has been used for various applications. So the Smalley group, right? The same guy who discovered the buckyball, they are using carbon nanotubes to make fibers for textile materials. Like the thread we make from cotton, so they thought, okay, this is a tube, so why not we can make a fiber. And this is another group, they make ropes from carbon nanotubes, and so the ropes will be much stronger, might have some applications. Some people start trying everything actually with the material when you found something new, and they might find application later on. Sometimes it doesn't have application right away, but maybe some specific conditions you might find some application. They make brushes, toothbrushes with the carbon nanotubes, and you can read about it more. I have given the name of a group that why they are doing it. At least if you have a very strong brush, I can see not as a toothbrush, but I think it can be used for maybe cleaning surfaces which are very harder, or to remove some material. But yeah, they were making it. You can see some images. So definitely it has been used in FET, single wall carbon nanotube-based FET, field effect transistor, because now the goal is to put a carbon nanotube between source and drain, so make the transistor even smaller. So single wall carbon nanotube, and then look at its characteristics. So you can even shrink the size of the devices. What they are doing here? Okay, so in this case they are using carbon nanotubes in the soldering material. When they solder materials together, that's very important. We want to make a very good connection, so because they are conductive, so they can make a good connection between one material and the other in the solder. They are also being explored for light polarization applications, which I don't know exactly what they're doing, but it has been used in that case also. Okay, so there are tons of applications of carbon nanotubes. The reason is that they are mechanically very strong in one axial direction, so they can provide mechanical strength. They are electrically very conductive, more conductive than copper and other materials, all this carbon. So that's why, and their sizes are very small. So that's why you see many different applications for in vivo imaging, for improving the strength of materials, and for making electronics because of its specific electrical properties and high mobility of electrons. Now, if you cut a carbon nanotube and slice it, and then we make a graphene, right? So this is how the graphene looks like. I think there was also one presentation in our class where about a graphene. So basically it's just the carbon atoms arranged in a single sheet. It's a 2D structure. The buckyball is 0D, carbon nanotube is 1D, and this is 2D. And it's just a single, if it's a single slice of carbon, and then it's called the carbon graphene. When it's multiple slices, then it becomes, when the multiple slices are connected together, then it becomes graphite. And graphite is what? Your pencil. This is a graphite. The pencil also have a graphite. So it has a carbon also, right? But in that case, it's not a single sheet. There are multiple sheets. And there are quite a few properties of the graphene, which makes it a very good material. They are 100 times more conductive in a sheet form than copper. So it's a very good conductive material. It's mechanically, in certain axial directions, more stronger than a diamond. So it's very strong and still flexible. So it can be used because it's a flexible and conductive. So it can be used for electronics, transparent electronic applications. And it's also transparent. It only absorbs 2 to 3% of the light. The rest of the light can pass through it. So basically, in the cell phones we use ITO, indium titanium oxide. So for touch screen, so those are electrodes under it which you cannot see. So we can use it's more conductive. So we can use graphene actually to make transparent electronics where we don't want people to see the electronics itself, but still there will be connections there. So mechanically strong, it can be used for in the materials to make it more stronger, and then for electrical, they are also being used for in vivo applications. I have seen many papers on that. For imaging, also attaching drugs with it because they can be produced in small flags. And then their size. The people have also used the carbon nanotubes for DNA sequencing, not carbon nanotube, the graphene, because it's a thin sheet, right? Very thin, single atom. And then you can actually make holes inside the sheet and that like nanopore and let the DNA to pass through, because now it's a single sheet. The channel length or the thickness of the channel will be very, very thin. So you can look at few bases. I think I discussed that in a previous class. You can look at a very 1 or 2 bases at one time. That provides you that flexibility. So it's a very good material in general. So if you look at the mobility, graphene is very, very conductive. I told you that it's similar to the carbon nanotubes, but slightly higher than the carbon nanotubes. The mobility of the electrons, which translate into conductivity. There are other indium antimonide material which are also conductive. But if in terms of comparison, because copper is normally used to make interconnects, if we use the carbon nanotubes of graphene, then it's 100 times more conductive. So, but why we want to make interconnects with the more conductive material? Do you know that? Anyone? When you make interconnects in the electronic devices, and we want the interconnect to be very conductive, because it will reduce the RC delay. I don't know whether we discussed that or not previously. So there is a delay because of resistance and capacitance of the interconnects. RC delay is a very common term used in electronics. So resistance and capacitance. So we want less resistance and we want less RC delay. So it means if it's more conductive, less resistance, so we can improve the RC delay, right? It means we can reduce the RC delay. We can work with the devices at much faster rate, because then there is less delay in transferring signals from one place to another. Now, how we can make these graphene membranes? The one way is the mechanical scotch tape thing, right? Which people have used one time. So if you take a graphite, put a scotch tape, put it a couple of times, and then you'll be able to maybe get one layer of carbon atom, but you really have to put an extra effort to find out where that layer is, because it's transparent, and the sizes which you will be getting from there would be micron size sheets, so which is very, very small, so you cannot really see it. So discovering that sheet would be difficult. So that's but there was one group, I think a couple of people, one was from Russia, one was from UK, I believe. They shared a Nobel Prize in 2010 or 11 on synthesizing graphene by using Scotch tape process, but they also did some other experiments with it. So that can tell you that how important the material is, and how important if you work in that area and do something in the graphene sheets. But later on, we want to actually, let's say if we want to use it for different applications, we want to produce a lot of graphene, maybe larger. Let's say if you want to use it for digital screens or something, transparent screens, then we have to produce it in a larger formats, larger sizes, not small flakes. So for that there are efforts, and then the one process which is used is a CVD again, it's a chemical vapor deposition. So it's a carbon source come into a material. Again, in this case, because we're not growing the tube, we want to grow graphene on the whole surface, right? So that we can have a larger section of graphene. So in that case, we put a metal as a catalyst as before, and it can be copper, and then you actually start producing with the CVD process graphene on the surface of the metal as before. And then later on you can etch actually metal from the other side. So you can cover the top of a graphene with some PMMA or some other polymers which will not react with the etchant, and then you etch the metal from the other side. In that way you can produce a graphene. So far what I know about these materials, they are very good materials, and a lot of work is going on in these in producing these materials, and also with different applications of materials. Handling these materials is very tricky and difficult. And graphene, let's say if you want to make a nanopore in a graphene, it's very hard to do the fabrication process itself. If you know the silicon dioxide and silicon-based nanopores, you can make this structure, right, with the QH. You can have a thin membrane on the other side which is stable, already attached, and then you can make a hole in there. But now let's say if you want to make a hole in graphene, it's just a one sheet. Let's say you produce a one sheet. Now how you can transfer one atomic layer in sheet to a certain place? The transferring it is a little bit tricky. If you grab it, it might break it in that direction. It is very strong in one axial direction, but not strong in this direction. So transferring it is very tricky. A lot of people are working on it. How we can improve the transfer, maybe grow it on the area where we want it to grow. Or so one way is they mix it in a solution and then transfer the solution on the surface where you want to put the graphene, so that it will stick with the surface. In that way they are trying to do the transfer. So handling these materials, there is a lot of work which need to be done so that we can reliably produce these materials in a smaller and larger sizes, and we have to improve handling of these materials and transfers. Same is the problem with the carbon nanotubes. You can grow carbon nanotubes, many of them on the surface, but let's say if you want to use them in a FET, for example, it has to be between source and drain. It has to be exactly that place. So if I produce a carbon nanotube some other place, and if I want to carry one carbon nanotube, I need to place it there. It will not be a very easy process. If we want to have to do it on a commercial scale, where there are millions of transistors, and how to put carbon nanotube at each different place for each device, it will be a terrible job. But there are efforts to grow carbon nanotubes right there where it need to be. And they have some successes, but still there are a lot of limitations, and that's why you don't see any commercial products still, but still it's under R&D work. People are working on it. I know the Intel and other companies are developing carbon nanotube based single carbon nanotube based transistors. They're exploring it. They have high good conductivity, so it can make the sizes small, but again the fabrication process is a little bit complicated. But these are the materials which are I would say current generation or next generation materials. Because the graphene is a carbon, and then the carbon nanotube is a carbon. If you take a carbon, same material, carbon doesn't have a charge, right? Once it's in that form, because all four atoms are electrons, 3 are shared with the other, and there's only one free. But it still is a hydrophobic material. You can try that. Maybe take a pencil lid and mix it, grind it, and put it in water. You will see they all become clump together again. So it's a hydrophobic. Carbon-based materials are normally hydrophobic unless it has some charged functional groups. So basically, when you put a graphene or graphite in a buffer and a blood, for example, or even in carbon nanotubes, then they will clump very quickly. So when they clump together, it means they're useless for that application. So they have those properties when they are not in a clump form, especially for in vivo imaging. So we have to functionalize these materials, and functionalizing them, there is a process to generate some breaks in their bonds and then attach some chemicals there, so that you can functionalize it with the certain antibodies or proteins, or depends what application you want to use them. So again, these materials in the raw form are not really dissolvable in water. So they are dissolved in other materials like alcohol and all that, but not in water or water-based aqueous solutions. Even blood is also aqueous, hydrophilic. So we have to do some treatment to make sure that they are fine. And then there's a lot of work again going on the toxicity studies of these graphene particles also, like how whether they are toxic or not, whether they rupture in compared to carbon nanotubes, whether these are more toxic or they're more toxic. So to find out whether we can have, because they have some properties which are similar, like mechanical strength, but the shape is different. So a lot of work is going on in that direction. And in sensing also, I told you the BioFETs are designed with single wall carbon nanotubes and all that. Okay, I'll stop there for today, and I'll see you then on next Tuesday. And next Tuesday, I think there will be presentations, so make sure who will be presenting. Prepare well for your presentation. We'll talk about the exam one more time later on, but there might be one more lecture on the content, but mostly this is what we'll be covering. Okay? I'll see you then next week.
Still recovering from yeah.